The moment my son stood up at the dinner table, pointed at me, and said, "She's not my mother," the room went silent. This was in a house meant for celebrations, not erasure. Crystal glasses paused halfway to lips. A chair scraped softly. Someone let out a nervous breath they couldn't pull back. I felt every eye turn toward me, then slide away, like looking too long would make them complicit. My son Jason didn't look at me. His shoulders were stiff. His face looked rehearsed, like he'd practiced this in a mirror and still didn't recognize himself. Before I could form a word, his wife Brandy stood. She didn't hesitate. She didn't stumble. She placed a thick folder on the table, neat and centered, like an exhibit. "These are adoption records," Brandy said, her voice steady. She was a temporary guardian. Not his legal parent. Temporary. Guardian. Not his mother. The words hit harder than the accusation itself. Someone across the table whispered, "That can't be right." Someone else leaned forward to read the pages. No one asked me anything. In my head, I heard Kelvin's voice from years ago, calm and deliberate, telling me to keep everything. Hospital papers. Court orders. DNA confirmations. Emails. "People rewrite history when money's involved," he'd said. I remembered teasing him for being paranoid. I wasn't teasing anymore. Jason finally spoke again. "We just want the truth out." The truth. From the boy I raised. From the man who shared my last name. From someone willing to erase me with photocopies. I looked around that table. Faces I'd fed. Holidays I'd hosted. Years I'd poured into building a family that now sat frozen, studying paper instead of memory. My hands were shaking, but I kept them still. I didn't argue. I didn't plead. I didn't explain. Because I already understood what this was. This wasn't about feelings. It wasn't even about family. It was about authority. Consent. Control. They thought the dinner table was the battlefield. They were wrong. So I stood, thanked everyone for coming, and walked out quietly, knowing the next time my son denied me, it wouldn't be in a dining room. It would be in a Kentucky courtroom, with the truth entered into the record forever. Before we go on, tell me where you're listening from, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories coming soon. My life looked stable from the outside. I, LaShonda Whitbourne, lived in Louisville, Kentucky, in the same house my late husband and I had owned for years. It wasn't flashy, but it carried weight, history, decisions, long conversations that shaped a family. I had learned to live with quiet after my husband Kelvin Whitbourne passed. Quiet mornings. Quiet evenings. The kind of quiet that comes after you've already given everything you had. My son Jason Whitbourne was grown by then. Confident. Polished. He spoke like someone used to being listened to. I used to feel proud of that. I told myself it meant I'd done something right. My daughter-in-law Brandy Whitbourne had been in our lives for years. Smart. Organized. Always 2 steps ahead of the room. She liked paperwork. Spreadsheets. Systems. I respected that at first. It felt responsible. And then there was my granddaughter Nyla Whitbourne, 9. Gentle. Observant. The kind of child who listened more than she spoke. She still reached for my hand without thinking. That mattered more to me than anything else. The estate was the reason everyone was suddenly polite again. Kelvin had built something enormous. Investments. Properties. Trust structures layered on top of each other. The kind of wealth that made people careful with their words and sharp with their intentions. I wasn't involved in day-to-day decisions anymore, by choice. I trusted the plan Kelvin and I had built together. My role was simple: be present, be available, give consent when required. That consent mattered. I didn't fully understand how much it mattered until later. When Jason invited me to the family dinner, he said it was about moving forward. About unity. About closing chapters. I believed him. I even dressed carefully that night, choosing calm over power, softness over authority. I didn't know I was walking into a test. And I didn't know the question was whether I would still be allowed to exist in my own family. The dinner was held at Jason's house, a place chosen carefully. Neutral ground. Expensive enough to feel important, unfamiliar enough to keep me off balance. When I arrived, everything looked staged. The table was set too perfectly. Candles evenly spaced. Place cards written in careful handwriting. Brandy's handwriting. I recognized it instantly. Jason greeted me with a brief hug that didn't quite land. His arms were stiff. His smile didn't reach his eyes. I told myself not to read into it. I had learned, over the years, how easy it was to misinterpret silence. Brandy moved through the room like a host and a manager at the same time. Adjusting chairs. Pouring wine. Making sure everyone was seen. When she looked at me, she smiled politely, the way people do when they're being observed. Nyla ran up and hugged me without hesitation. Wrapped her arms around my waist and pressed her cheek against me. I held her a second longer than usual, like my body already sensed something was wrong. Conversation stayed light at first. Safe topics. Travel. Work. Someone joked about the traffic. Plates were passed. Glasses clinked. I noticed Jason barely spoke. He kept checking his phone. Looking at Brandy. Waiting. At one point, Brandy caught my eye and nodded toward the dining table, like we were about to begin something formal. Not dinner. Something else. I felt a quiet tightening in my chest. Not fear exactly. More like recognition. This wasn't a family meal. It was a presentation. When everyone finally sat down, the room settled into an expectant hush. Chairs stopped moving. Forks rested against plates. Jason stood up. Not to toast. Not to welcome anyone. Just stood there, breathing shallow, hands flat on the table, eyes fixed forward. That was when I understood. Whatever was coming had already been decided. And I was the only one in the room who hadn't been told the script. Jason didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He straightened slowly, like he was bracing himself, then actually pointed, across the table at me. She's not my mother. The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They landed heavy and final, like something that had been rehearsed until it lost emotion. For a second, no one reacted. Not a gasp. Not a question. Just silence so complete I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the other room. I looked at Jason, waiting for his eyes to meet mine. They didn't. His gaze stayed fixed on the wall behind me, like I was an object he'd already discarded. Someone near the end of the table laughed softly, unsure. That's not funny, they said. Jason didn't sit down. Brandy stood immediately, like this was her cue. She reached under her chair and pulled out a folder. Thick. Tabbed. Prepared. She placed it on the table and slid it forward, stopping just short of my place setting. These are copies of the legal records, Brandy said evenly. Adoption and guardianship documents. She was never his legal parent. She was a temporary guardian. Temporary. Guardian. Each word felt designed to shrink me. I felt my chest tighten, but my body stayed still. I didn't speak. I didn't reach for the papers. I watched as other people leaned in to read them, their faces shifting from confusion to uncertainty. Jason cleared his throat. We just think everyone deserves to know the truth. The truth. I had changed his diapers. Sat in hospital rooms. Signed school forms. Stood in courtrooms. Buried his father. And now, with one sentence and a stack of copied pages, I was being rewritten. I finally understood something then. This wasn't anger. It wasn't resentment. It was strategy. They weren't trying to hurt me. They were trying to erase me. The room didn't explode the way you'd expect. It collapsed inward. People looked at the papers instead of at me. Like ink held more authority than memory. Someone whispered, "Is that real?" Someone else said nothing at all, which somehow felt worse. I stayed seated. My back straight. My hands folded in my lap. I could feel my pulse in my throat, but I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing it. Randy began explaining without being asked. Pointing to lines. Highlighted sections. Dates taken out of context. She spoke slowly, confidently, like a teacher correcting a student who should have known better. Jason nodded along. Once. Twice. He still wouldn't look at me. I noticed how carefully they avoided certain details. How they skipped years. How they framed my role like it had an expiration date. Across the table, someone finally asked, "So, who signed everything?" Randy smiled tightly. "That's all in there." She didn't say my name. That omission mattered. I felt eyes flick toward me, then away again. No one asked me to speak. No one defended me out loud. Not yet. Silence spread, heavy and contagious. Inside, memories surfaced without warning. Hospital corridors. Courtrooms with wooden benches. Papers I had signed in ink that bled slightly into cheap forms. Records I had kept because something in me always knew paper could be weaponized. But I didn't reach for the folder. I didn't interrupt. Because arguing in that moment would have turned this into what they wanted, an emotional spectacle. A grieving woman unraveling at a dinner table. I wasn't going to give them that. I lifted my glass instead, took a slow sip of water, and placed it back down with steady hands. Then I looked directly at Jason for the first time. He flinched. And in that tiny reaction, I understood something important. This performance wasn't meant to convince me. It was meant to convince everyone else. I stood up slowly. Not in anger. Not in shock. Just with the quiet certainty that staying would turn me into a prop in someone else's story. Chairs shifted as I pushed mine back. A few people looked relieved, like my exit would release them from having to choose a side. Randy stopped talking mid-sentence. Jason finally looked at me then, his expression caught somewhere between guilt and resolve. "I think that's enough for tonight," I said. My voice surprised even me. Steady. Controlled. No one argued. I walked around the table, past the folder, past the faces that wouldn't meet my eyes. At the door, Nyla stood frozen, confused, her small hands clenched at her sides. I knelt, smoothed her hair, and whispered that I'd call her tomorrow. Randy shifted uncomfortably. Jason said nothing. Outside, the air felt sharp and clean, like my lungs had been working overtime inside that house. I sat in my car for a moment without turning the key, letting the silence settle. That was when the truth finally crystallized. This hadn't been impulsive. It hadn't been emotional. It had been timed. Coordinated. The dinner. The witnesses. The paperwork. All of it placed carefully around one central goal. Authority. They needed me discredited before anything official happened. Before filings. Before signatures. Before questions. And they believed I would react the way they needed me to, loud, defensive, shaken. Instead, I drove home. When I walked into my house, I didn't turn on the lights. I went straight to the study, unlocked the lower drawer of my file cabinet, and pulled out a folder I hadn't touched in years. It was heavier than Brandy's. Thicker. Original. I ran my fingers over the worn edges and felt something settle deep in my chest. They thought the story ended at the dinner table. They were wrong. That night, I didn't cry. I planned. By morning, the shock had worn off. What replaced it wasn't rage. It was clarity. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of untouched coffee, replaying the night frame by frame. The timing wasn't accidental. The audience wasn't accidental. Even the wording had been chosen carefully. Not estranged. Not confused. Not my mother. That phrase did something specific. It didn't just hurt me. It challenged my legal standing. That's when the estate finally came into focus. Kelvin had built protections that tied key decisions to my legal standing in the family, especially anything that affected Jason's share. His assets were complex by design. Layered trusts. Conditional distributions. Safeguards meant for moments when people stopped acting in good faith. I hadn't handled the mechanics myself, but I had signed off on structures that required one thing above all else. My consent. If they could strip me of the title of mother, they could argue I had no standing to delay, question, or block final distribution. No authority. No voice. The dinner wasn't about humiliation. It was a preemptive strike. I thought about Jason, how he'd avoided my eyes, how stiff his body had been. That wasn't confidence. It was compliance. Someone else had done the homework. Someone else had built the plan. Brandy. Her precision made sense now. The tabs. The phrasing. The selective omissions. She hadn't invented a lie from nothing. She'd trimmed the truth until it bled out. I carried my coffee into the study and opened the file cabinet fully this time. Not just the adoption paperwork. Everything. Court orders. Hospital forms. DNA confirmations. Letters. Emails. Originals with raised seals and timestamps that couldn't be argued away. I spread them across the desk, organizing them the way I always had, chronological, clean, undeniable. For the first time since the dinner, I felt steady. Because lies only work when they go unanswered. And I wasn't planning to answer emotionally. I was going to answer officially. Slowly. In the one place that still respected facts over performance. Court. That afternoon, I made one phone call. Not to family. Not to friends. I already knew how those conversations would go, awkward pauses, careful neutrality, people afraid of choosing wrong. I didn't need comfort. I needed precision. I called Taryn Kingsford, the estate attorney Kelvin had trusted for years. When he answered, I didn't explain the dinner. I didn't describe how it felt. I said one sentence. They're challenging my status as Jason's legal mother. There was a pause on the line. Not confusion. Calculation. Send me everything you have, Taryn said. Originals, if possible. That told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't unusual. Not at that level of money. Not with families who smiled in public and sharpened knives in private. I spent the rest of the day scanning documents, labeling files, building a timeline. Each page felt like a quiet witness. Dates lining up. Signatures consistent. Court seals intact. The truth didn't need embellishment. It stood on its own. As evening settled in, my phone buzzed with a message from Jason. We didn't mean to blindside you. We just want to clear things up. Clear things up. I stared at the screen for a long moment before setting the phone face down. I didn't respond. Any reply would become evidence, and not the kind I wanted on record. Later, Taryn called back. What they showed at that dinner, he said carefully, can't override certified court orders. But once they've said it publicly, they'll have to say it formally. And that's where this gets decided. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the documents spread across my desk. So that was the plan. Force the lie into the system. Make it official. Hope I'd panic or settle or disappear. I didn't feel panicked. I felt ready. If they wanted to question my place in my son's life, they could do it properly. With filings. Hearings. Records. And consequences. The next few days passed quietly on the surface. No calls. No confrontations. No public fallout yet. Just a careful, unnatural calm that told me something was moving underneath. Taryn called midweek to confirm receipt of the documents. His tone was neutral, but his questions weren't. Do you remember ever signing anything that limited your parental rights? No, any guardianship expiration? No, any adoption reversal? Never. Each answer landed solid. Clean. Still, he warned me about timing. If they file first, he said, they control the framing. Not the outcome, but the opening narrative. That mattered. Because narrative shapes pressure. Pressure shapes settlements. And settlements favor the side with less to lose. I thought about how Brandy had used the dinner. How she'd placed doubt before facts. Emotion before process. She hadn't needed the lie to be airtight. She only needed it to feel plausible long enough to move money. That afternoon, I received notice that a preliminary probate filing had been made. No details yet. Just confirmation that something was officially in motion. So the lie had entered the system. Good. Taryn and I met the following morning. He reviewed the originals in person, checking seals, margins, ink impressions. He didn't rush. He didn't reassure me with empty words. When he finally looked up, he said, they don't have a case. But they might still have an audience. That distinction stayed with me. Winning wasn't just about being right. It was about being unshakable while the truth surfaced. As I left his office, I realized something else. They had assumed I would scramble. Explain. Defend myself to relatives. Beg for understanding. Instead, I had done nothing visible at all. And that silence was already making them nervous. Because when someone stops arguing, it usually means they've started preparing. The first cracks showed up through other people. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in months called just to check in. A former family friend sent a vague message about hearing some confusing things. Even the tone of their voices told me the story was traveling, softened, edited, stripped of its cruelty but carrying the same implication. Brandy was working the perimeter. She didn't accuse me outright anymore. She didn't need to. She framed it as concern. As clarification. As a misunderstanding that needed to be handled carefully. Handled. I could almost hear her voice saying it. Jason stayed quiet. No calls. No texts. That silence spoke louder than any statement. He had stepped back, letting the narrative circulate without correction. That told me something important. This wasn't a momentary lapse. It was a choice. Taryn forwarded me a copy of the probate objection when it became available. The language was careful but unmistakable. My legal relationship to Jason was being questioned. My authority was being framed as unresolved. Unresolved was generous. Still, it was enough to slow things down. Enough to create leverage. Enough to pressure me toward negotiation. That evening, I sat alone in my living room, listening to the quiet hum of the house Kelvin and I had built. I thought about the years I'd spent protecting Jason from consequences. From discomfort. From hard truths. I wondered when that protection had turned into entitlement. The anger came then, sharp and focused. Not loud. Not reckless. Useful. Because I finally understood the real cost of staying silent for too long. If I didn't end this decisively, it wouldn't stop with me. It would reach Nyla. Her future. Her security. And that was something I would not allow. They had tried to erase my past. Now I was going to secure the future. By the end of that week, the illusion was gone. The probate objection was no longer rumor or suggestion. It was stamped, logged, and waiting. My name sat inside it, not as a mother, but as a question mark. That was the breaking point. Not because I doubted myself, but because I finally saw the full shape of what they were willing to do. They weren't just trying to win money. They were willing to rewrite history, fracture family ties, and gamble with a child's future to get there. I sat back down in the study and opened one last folder I hadn't touched yet. Inside were the contingency instructions Kelvin had written in his own hand. Not legal language. Personal language. Notes meant for moments like this. If anyone challenges LaShonda's standing, one line read, activate protections immediately. He had known. Maybe not this exact betrayal. But the possibility of one. I scanned everything again, slower this time, thinking like someone who wasn't defending herself anymore, someone who was about to assert control. Trust clauses. Trigger conditions. Discretionary powers that only activated under conflict. This wasn't just about proving I was Jason's mother. It was about deciding what kind of future came after that truth was established. I closed the file and picked up my phone. I didn't call Jason. I didn't call Brandy. I called Taryn. I want to proceed, I said. No delays. No private discussions. We let this go to court. There was a brief pause. Then, understood. When the call ended, I felt something settle into place. The uncertainty. The waiting. The restraint. They had made their move. Now it was my turn. The first filing didn't come with drama. No knock at the door. No confrontation. Just an alert from Taryn that the objection had been formally logged and assigned a hearing window. Taryn and I met in his office downtown, a quiet space designed to absorb conflict without reacting to it. He laid out the procedural map with care, not rushing, making sure every step stayed grounded. "They've forced the issue," he said. "Which means we let the system do what it's built to do." He explained the strategy plainly. We wouldn't attack the lie emotionally. We would let it stand just long enough to be examined. Certified copies. Chain of custody. Court seals. Timelines. The kind of details that don't bend under pressure. But there was friction. Some of the records were decades old. Stored off-site. Archived under older indexing systems. Requests would take time. Weeks, not days. That delay was intentional protection back then. Now it was an obstacle. I felt the familiar itch of impatience, but I didn't push it away. I studied it. Learned from it. Panic rushes things. Control waits. Taryn slid a checklist across the desk. We start with hospital records and court orders. DNA confirmations come later. We don't overwhelm the court. We build a staircase. One step at a time. As I signed the first authorization forms, I realized something important. This phase wasn't about revenge yet. It was about posture. Letting Jason and Brandy believe their move had worked. Letting them settle into confidence. Letting them underestimate the silence. Outside the office, Louisville moved like nothing had changed. Cars passed. People laughed. Life went on. But beneath that calm, something irreversible was happening. The lie had officially entered the system. And now, so had the truth. Slowly. Deliberately. On my terms. The waiting started immediately. Not the dramatic kind. The procedural kind. The kind that tests discipline more than courage. Taryn filed the first set of formal requests the same day, certified hospital birth records, intake forms, and the original court orders tied to my guardianship and adoption status. Each request went to a different department. Different storage facilities. Different timelines. None of them moved fast. A clerk confirmed receipt but couldn't promise dates. Another office required additional verification. One archive had shifted vendors years ago, which meant older files had to be manually retrieved. Friction, exactly as Taryn had warned. Every delay was logged. Every call documented. Nothing informal. Nothing rushed. Meanwhile, Brandy's narrative continued its quiet spread. I didn't hear it directly. I heard it through tone changes. Through pauses in conversations that used to be easy. Through the way people suddenly said, "I don't want to get involved." That suited me fine. Because while she was shaping opinion, I was shaping record. One afternoon, Taryn forwarded me a partial response from the hospital system. Not the documents yet, just confirmation that records existed under my name, with a note indicating sealed attachments. That mattered. Sealed meant protected. Untouched. Harder to manipulate. I felt a flicker of relief, then pushed it aside. This wasn't the moment for emotion. It was the moment for patience. Jason sent another message that night. Can we talk before this gets bigger? I didn't respond. Talking creates ambiguity. Filings create clarity. Before bed, I organized the growing paper trail on my desk, outgoing requests on one side, incoming confirmations on the other. A physical reminder that progress doesn't always look like movement. Sometimes it looks like silence. And silence, when documented, becomes leverage. The first obstacle arrived disguised as routine. Taryn called to tell me the court archive had located the adoption file, but not the way we expected. Portions had been microfilmed decades ago, then transferred between systems during a records overhaul. The indexing wasn't clean. Some pages were miscategorized. Others required in-person verification. Translation, time. They're not lost, Taryn said. They're just buried. Buried was almost worse. Because buried records create doubt before they create proof. We scheduled an in-person review. No shortcuts. No assumptions. Just presence and persistence. I cleared my calendar without hesitation. At the courthouse records office, the air smelled faintly of dust and paper. A staff member rolled out a cart stacked with gray boxes, each labeled in careful handwriting. This was where truths went when they got old enough to be inconvenient. We worked slowly. Page by page. Cross-referencing numbers, stamps, initials. Some documents were intact. Others were copies of copies, faint but legible. Then we hit the gap. A critical court order, one I remembered clearly, was referenced but not immediately visible. Not missing. Just not where it should have been. I felt the pressure tighten in my chest. This was the danger of time. Not erasure, but erosion. The clerk explained that certain sealed orders were stored separately under a different retention rule. Retrieval required judicial authorization. Another delay. Another gate. As we left, Taryn caught my expression. This is normal, he said. And it cuts both ways. If it's sealed, it hasn't been altered. That steadied me. Because Brandy's copies were clean. Too clean. No seals. No microfilm artifacts. No wear. What she'd presented was convenient. What I was uncovering was real. And real records resist haste, but they also resist lies. This wasn't a setback. It was friction doing exactly what it was meant to do, protect the truth until the right moment. The hospital was the next gate. Taryn arranged the meeting, but he didn't come inside with me. That part was intentional. Fewer voices. Less pressure. Just the records and the person responsible for them. The records supervisor introduced himself as Corey Dunley, explaining his role before I asked. Custodian. Compliance. Chain of custody. He spoke carefully, like someone used to weighing words. I can confirm records exist, Corey said. But release isn't automatic. Especially for sealed or legacy files. I nodded. I wasn't there to persuade him. I was there to respect the process. He pulled up a screen and scrolled slowly. Dates flashed past. Intake codes. Physician initials. Then he stopped. There it is, he said. Linked to your name. Not guardian. Not temporary. My name. Clean. Continuous. But when I asked about copies, his expression shifted. Some attachments require secondary verification. Old privacy rules. We'll need written authorization from the court. Another delay. I felt the familiar tightening, but I didn't argue. I asked what documentation would be required and how long the process usually took. Corey answered plainly. 2 weeks, sometimes longer. Before I left, he added something quietly. For what it's worth, these records haven't been accessed in decades. No recent polls. No edits. That mattered. Because it meant Brandy hadn't sourced her paperwork from here. Outside, I sat in my car and wrote everything down. Names. Times. Statements. I didn't trust memory anymore. I trusted notes. That evening, Taryn confirmed what I already knew. Hospital records and court orders, independently sealed, pointing to the same truth. 2 systems. 1 reality. And a lie that couldn't survive both. Brandy reached out 3 days later. Not directly. She used language that gave her room to retreat. A message framed as concern, sent early in the afternoon, time to look considerate. I think things escalated faster than anyone intended. Maybe we should clear this up privately before lawyers make it worse. Privately. That word carried weight. Private conversations don't leave records. They don't create timelines. They blur responsibility and soften accountability. I understood exactly what she was offering. An off-ramp. I didn't respond right away. I let the message sit, unopened, long enough to be seen but unanswered. Silence can speak without committing you to anything. Later that evening, Jason followed up. I don't want this turning into something ugly. We can talk. Just us. Just us. That was new. And revealing. Because now the pressure wasn't about truth. It was about containment. They were worried. Not because they discovered my evidence yet, but because the system was moving without them being able to control it. Requests filed. Records pulled. Silence maintained. That's when I felt the internal shift complete. This was the first real fear to power moment. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was dictating tempo. I forwarded both messages to Taryn without comment. He called me an hour later. This is expected, he said. They're testing whether you'll step outside the process. I won't, I said. Good, he replied. Because the moment you do, they'll claim confusion instead of fabrication. That night, I finally replied to Jason. I'm comfortable letting the court resolve it. Nothing more. No emotion. No blame. Just a boundary. And when I set my phone down, I felt something unfamiliar but steady take hold. Confidence. Not in outcome, but in position. For the first time since the dinner, they were reacting to me. The response was immediate. Jason read my message within minutes. No reply followed. That silence wasn't relief. It was recalibration. The next morning, Taryn called with an update. They've retained separate counsel, he said. And they've requested an expedited hearing. There it was. Escalation. On paper, it sounded confident. In reality, it was rushed. Expedited hearings favor whoever has already prepared. Whoever isn't scrambling to backfill evidence. That wasn't them. Taryn explained the risk calmly. An early hearing could amplify their narrative before our full documentary record was assembled. But it also forced them to commit, to put their claim in writing, under signature, subject to scrutiny. I chose commitment over comfort. Let them, I said. That decision surprised even me. A few weeks earlier, I would have wanted more time. More certainty. Now, certainty came from posture, not completion. By afternoon, the formal filing arrived. Jason's objection, now sharpened. Language tightened. Assertions framed as questions. My legal relationship described as unclear. Unclear is how lies survive. But something else stood out. Brandy wasn't listed as a filer. She was present everywhere else, emails, coordination, timing, but absent on paper. That omission wasn't accidental. It was insulation. Taryn noticed it too. She's staying off record, he said. For now. That told us where the pressure points were. I spent the rest of the day preparing affidavits. Not emotional ones. Factual ones. Dates. Places. Processes. Statements that could be verified or disproven, but not spun. That night, alone in my study, I realized how far I'd moved from the woman at that dinner table. I wasn't trying to be believed anymore. I was building something stronger. A record. And once a record exists, belief becomes irrelevant. The first real break didn't come from a courtroom. It came from my own files. While organizing affidavits, I pulled an old external drive from the back of my drawer, one I hadn't touched since before Kelvin passed. It held archived emails, backups I'd kept out of habit more than intention. I searched Brandy's name. At first, nothing useful. Polite exchanges. Scheduling. Thank you notes. Then I widened the date range to the months leading up to the dinner. That's when the pattern appeared. Emails sent late at night. Drafts never forwarded to me. Messages where Brandy asked for copies only, specifically requesting summaries instead of originals. One message referenced how it should be framed if questions come up. Framed. I read it twice. She never said lie. She didn't have to. The intent lived between the lines: selective truth, strategic omission, plausible deniability. One email, in particular, made my hands go still. As long as LaShonda's role is presented as temporary, consent becomes a non-issue. There it was. Not emotional. Not confused. Calculated. I forwarded the entire thread to Taryn with a single note, found something relevant. He called within minutes. This changes posture, he said. Not outcome, but leverage. Because now we weren't just disproving a claim. We were establishing orchestration. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. Not because I felt vindicated, but because the story was finally aligning. Documents. Timelines. Intent. Brandy had assumed I would defend myself in the present. She hadn't counted on the past keeping receipts. And for the first time since this began, I could see the midpoint ahead, not as a cliff, but as a turn. They had made their move. Now we had proof of why. The escalation came faster than I expected. 2 days after Taryn received the emails, he called early in the morning. His voice was steady, but there was no mistaking the shift. They've filed a supplemental objection, he said. And they're pushing for immediate evidentiary review. That was the trap. By escalating now, Jason and his counsel were trying to force the court to rule before the full record surfaced, before sealed files, before hospital confirmations, before intent could be clearly established. If they could get the judge to focus narrowly on their copies, they might create just enough uncertainty to extract a concession. They weren't trying to win outright. They were trying to corner me. Taryn laid out the options. We could resist the expedited schedule and risk looking evasive. Or we could accept it and turn the pressure back on them. I chose the second. Let's respond, I said. But we don't argue yet. Instead of countering emotionally, Taryn filed a procedural response requesting consolidation of all related records under judicial supervision. Court orders. Hospital files. Archived materials. And, critically, communications related to document sourcing. That last part mattered. Because once the court agreed, Brandy's absence from the filings would stop protecting her. By afternoon, the court issued a temporary order granting review and scheduling a formal evidentiary hearing. No ruling yet. Just structure. But structure is power. Jason texted me that evening. This is getting out of hand. I stared at the message, then set the phone down without replying. Out of hand was a performance at a dinner table. This was procedure. This was where words became sworn statements and copies faced originals. As I reviewed the hearing notice, one thought settled in with absolute clarity. They had forced the issue into the one place where confidence didn't matter. Only proof did. And proof was finally lining up. Preparation shifted into a different gear after that. Taryn moved quickly but methodically, filing motions that didn't argue conclusions, only access. Certified originals. Chain of custody logs. Verification of seals. Requests framed so narrowly they couldn't be refused without explanation. That was deliberate. Courts don't like drama. They like clean questions with clean answers. Taryn gave them exactly that. Meanwhile, I stayed out of sight. No statements. No messages. No quiet apologies accepted or rejected. Every interaction now flowed through counsel. That distance wasn't coldness. It was discipline. The first confirmation arrived midweek. The court archive had approved retrieval of the sealed order, the one missing from the initial index. It would be delivered directly to Chambers. Not to us. Not to them. Directly to the judge. That detail mattered more than any argument. Because once the record bypasses both sides, it stops being a weapon and becomes a fact. Taryn explained the next step carefully. When a court sees the seal and the date, he said, the narrative collapses. But we don't rush the collapse. We let it happen in sequence. Sequence creates inevitability. I thought about Brandy then. About how carefully she'd avoided putting her name on anything. How she'd tried to stay one layer removed, pulling strings without fingerprints. That works in families. It doesn't work in systems. Because systems record patterns, not personalities. As the filings went out, I felt the tension change. Not disappear, but reorganize. The fear that had lived in my chest since the dinner was gone. In its place was focus. I wasn't waiting to be believed. I was waiting for the process to catch up. And once it did, no one would be able to pretend this was confusion. It would be what it always was. A deliberate attempt to erase me, and a record proving they failed. The confirmation came from an unexpected place. Taryn forwarded an email from the probate clerk assigned to the case, Michaela Rivergate, flagged as informational. It wasn't an opinion. It wasn't advice. Just a notice, brief, precise, and quietly devastating. There were discrepancies. The copies submitted with Jason's objection didn't match the court's formatting standards from that time period. Margins were off. The docket reference numbers didn't align with the archival system used in that year. Small things, invisible to anyone outside the system. But unmistakable to someone inside it. Michaela didn't accuse anyone. She didn't need to. She simply noted that the documents provided by opposing counsel would require additional verification before being admitted. Verification is a polite word. It means doubt. Taryn smiled when he called me. Not triumphantly. Professionally. This is how it starts, he said. The system noticing inconsistencies. That night, I reviewed the copies Brandy had waved at the dinner table in my mind. How clean they were. Too clean. No age. No wear. No institutional scars. Paper that hasn't lived in a system always tells on itself. Jason's counsel requested time to supplement the record. Another delay. Another sign of scrambling. And then something else happened. Brandy's name appeared indirectly in a metadata reference attached to one of the files. Not as an author. Not as a signer. But as the source of the upload. That was new. Taryn noted it without comment, adding it to the growing chain. No confrontation. No exposure yet. Just accumulation. As I sat alone that evening, I realized the power had fully shifted. They were no longer attacking me. They were defending their paperwork. And in a courtroom, that's already a loss. Because paper doesn't get emotional. It either holds up. Or it doesn't. The hospital verification arrived the following morning. Taryn called before I even finished breakfast. Corey has completed the review, he said. And he's willing to certify. That was bigger than it sounded. Certification meant Corey wasn't just confirming records existed, he was willing to attach his name to their integrity. Chain of custody. Dates. Unbroken continuity from intake to archive. We met at the hospital that afternoon, this time with Taryn present. Corey laid out the file calmly, almost reverently, as if he understood the weight it carried. These records were sealed under legacy policy, he explained. No amendments. No external access. No edits. Ever. He pointed to specific identifiers, codes no longer in use, physician initials tied to a retired system, timestamps that predated digital formatting. Details impossible to fake without deep institutional access. Randy didn't have that access. Jason didn't either. Corey prepared a sworn statement confirming that I was listed as the legal mother from the moment of intake, with no subsequent modification or limitation. No temporary status. No guardianship expiration. No ambiguity. Taryn thanked him, asked a few precise questions, then requested the certification be transmitted directly to the court. Again, bypassing both sides. As we walked out, Taryn said quietly, "This locks the door." I felt the weight of that phrase settle. Because now the lie wasn't just contradicted. It was isolated. Court record on one side. Hospital system on the other. Both pointing in the same direction. That evening, Jason called for the first time since the dinner. I let it go to voicemail. Some conversations don't deserve to exist outside sworn testimony. And this one was long past that point. The tone changed after that. Not publicly. Not yet. But in the filings. Jason's next submission was thinner. Fewer assertions. More qualifiers. Language that leaned on phrases like "to the best of our knowledge" and "upon information and belief." The confidence was gone. Taryn noticed it immediately. "They're backing away from certainty," he said. "That's not retreat. It's survival. Because once certainty collapses, responsibility starts looking for somewhere else to land." Randy still wasn't on paper. Still insulated. Still silent. But her absence was starting to look deliberate instead of incidental. The court doesn't ignore patterns like that. A status conference was scheduled. Short. Procedural. No testimony. Just alignment before the evidentiary hearing. I didn't attend. Taryn did. When he called afterward, his voice was calm but precise. The judge asked why the source of the documents hasn't been disclosed. That question mattered more than any ruling. Because it meant the court wasn't just weighing what was submitted anymore. It was asking who had shaped it. Jason's counsel had no clean answer. Just generalities. Just distance. That distance widened the crack. That evening, I reread the emails Brandy had written months before the dinner. The phrasing felt different now. Not clever. Not controlled. Careless. She had assumed no one would ever read them in sequence. That they'd stay private. Contextless. Harmless. But intent doesn't need to shout. It only needs to be consistent. As I closed my laptop, I realized something else. The midpoint wasn't coming. We had already crossed it. The power shift wasn't loud. It was procedural. And from this point on, everything they did would be defensive. Because the truth was no longer chasing them. It was waiting. Brandy finally stepped forward. Not in person. Not under oath. But through counsel. Her attorney submitted a brief statement positioning her as a passive participant, someone who had relied on information provided and acted in good faith while trying to support her husband. Support. That word did a lot of work. Taryn read the filing twice before calling me. "She's minimizing," he said. "And she's careful not to deny involvement entirely." Which was telling. Because denial would require facts. Minimization only requires tone. The statement avoided specifics. No dates. No emails. No explanation for why she had requested copies instead of originals. No reason for why her metadata appeared in the uploads. Just implication. At the evidentiary hearing, that wouldn't hold. But the hearing hadn't happened yet. This was positioning. Preparing a fallback narrative before the record closed around her. Taryn responded with a narrow request, nothing confrontational. Just a motion asking the court to compel disclosure of all communications related to document sourcing and presentation. No accusations. Just scope. The judge granted it without comment. That silence mattered. Because silence, at that stage, isn't neutrality. It's permission. That night, I sat alone and thought about Brandy in a way I hadn't before. Not as an antagonist, but as a strategist who had miscalculated one thing. She'd assumed I would fight like a mother. Emotionally. Desperately. Loudly. She hadn't accounted for me fighting like a steward. Methodical. Detached. Focused on outcome, not approval. The distinction changed everything. Because now, even her attempt to step back had become another step forward, toward exposure. And there was no clean exit left. Only degrees of consequence. The court set the evidentiary hearing for 3 weeks out. That window wasn't generous. It was deliberate. Enough time for compliance. Not enough time to reinvent a story. Taryn explained what that meant in practical terms. Everything gets locked, he said. No more informal shaping. Whatever exists by then is what exists. Brandy's counsel requested an extension the following day. Cited volume. Complexity. Scheduling conflicts. The judge denied it. That denial landed harder than any rebuke. Because it told us the court saw the pattern. Delay after delay. Partial disclosures. Strategic vagueness. The patience was thinning. Discovery responses began arriving in batches. Emails first. Attachments later. Some redacted. Some incomplete. But enough to reveal structure. Brandy's name appeared again. Not as a signer. As a coordinator. Forwarding. Consolidating. Annotating. Always one step removed, but always present. Jason, meanwhile, submitted a declaration that tried to soften his role. He spoke about confusion. About trusting his spouse. About wanting clarity for the family. Taryn read it once and set it aside. This isn't a confession, he said. It's insulation. Which was fine. We weren't looking for apology. We were building a record. As the hearing date approached, I felt an unexpected calm. Not relief. Readiness. I wasn't imagining victory speeches or dramatic confrontations. I was imagining binders. Exhibits. Timelines laid out in clean sequence. Truth presented without performance. That's what unnerved them. Because performances can be countered. But structure? Structure stands. And once it stands in court, it doesn't move again. The final pre-hearing filing arrived on a Friday afternoon. Taryn called me before I even saw it. They've narrowed their position, he said. Significantly. When I read it, I understood what he meant. The language no longer challenged my status directly. Instead, it questioned process. Suggested ambiguity in historical practices. Raised abstract concerns without attaching them to facts. It was a retreat disguised as refinement. They weren't trying to win anymore. They were trying to survive with minimal damage. Taryn's response was simple. He submitted a consolidated exhibit list, chronological, indexed, cross-referenced. Court orders. Hospital certifications. Chain of custody affidavits. And, at the center, the email thread showing intent. No commentary. Just evidence. That restraint was intentional. Courts trust what doesn't oversell itself. Later that evening, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. It was Brandy. Her voice was steady but strained. I think we're all under a lot of pressure, she said. Maybe there's a way to resolve this without making it permanent. Permanent. That was the word that gave her away. She wasn't worried about the truth. She was worried about the record. I didn't return the call. By the time night settled in, the exhibits were locked. No more additions. No more revisions. Everything that mattered was already in place. I stood in my study and looked at the binders stacked neatly on my desk. They weren't dramatic. They weren't emotional. They were undeniable. Tomorrow, we would walk into court not to argue who I was, but to confirm it. And once that confirmation entered the record, there would be no erasing it again. The night before the hearing was quiet. Not the restless kind. The settled kind. Like the air before something irreversible. I didn't rehearse what I would say. I didn't imagine cross-examinations or objections. Taryn had prepared for all of that. My role now was simple: be present, be accurate, be unmoved. I laid out my clothes carefully. Nothing symbolic. Nothing dramatic. Neutral colors. Clean lines. The kind of outfit that doesn't ask to be remembered. Because tomorrow wasn't about me performing. It was about the record closing around the truth. I reviewed the timeline one last time, not to memorize it, but to feel its shape. Birth records. Court orders. Seals. Emails. Each piece sitting exactly where it belonged. No gaps. No leaps. No emotional shortcuts. This was the end of reaction. The fear to power arc had completed itself without fanfare. Earlier that evening, Taryn sent a brief message: "We're ready. Get some rest." That was all. Jason didn't reach out again. Neither did Brandy. Silence, at that stage, wasn't strategy anymore. It was resignation. I thought about the dinner table. The pointing finger. The folder sliding toward me. The way they'd tried to turn memory into doubt. And I realized something quietly profound. They had already lost the moment they chose spectacle over substance. Because spectacle fades. Records don't. As I turned off the light in my study, I felt no urge to rehearse justice or imagine apology. I felt something steadier than either. Certainty. Tomorrow, the court wouldn't decide who I was. It would confirm it. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. No grand benches. No raised voices. Just wood, light, and a quiet order that didn't bend for anyone's feelings. I sat beside Taryn, hands folded, eyes forward. Across the aisle, Jason sat rigid, his attorney whispering occasionally. Brandy was there too, seated one row back. Close enough to be present. Far enough to pretend distance. When the judge entered, the room rose and settled again. And just like that, everything narrowed. This wasn't about family anymore. It was about record. The judge began by summarizing the issue plainly: whether my legal status as Jason's mother had ever been temporary, conditional, or revoked. No drama. No accusations. Just the question. Taryn stood and submitted the sealed court order first. It was handed directly to the clerk, then to the judge. No objections. No commentary. The judge read silently. Then the hospital certification followed. Corey's affidavit. Chain of custody verification. Dates that aligned too cleanly to be coincidence. One system after another, saying the same thing. I didn't look at Jason. I didn't look at Brandy. I watched the judge. When the judge finally spoke, the words were simple. The court recognizes LaShonda Whitbourne as the legal mother of Jason Whitbourne, without limitation, interruption, or ambiguity. That was it. No gavel slam. No speech. Just confirmation. The objection was dismissed. The denial, officially erased. As the judge moved on to the next matter, I felt something lift that I hadn't realized I was still carrying. Not anger. Not grief. Wait. The ruling didn't end the hearing. It reframed it. With my status confirmed, the judge turned to the remaining filings. The tone shifted, not toward punishment, but toward consequence. The question was no longer who I was. It was what had been done. Taryn requested the court address the submission of inconsistent documents and the failure to disclose their sourcing. Again, no accusations. Just references. Page numbers. Metadata entries. The judge reviewed them carefully, asking Jason's counsel to explain the discrepancies. The answers came slowly. Carefully. Too carefully. Language softened. Responsibility blurred. Phrases like misunderstanding and incomplete information floated into the room, unsupported. The judge didn't interrupt. When Brandy's attorney attempted to distance her further, the judge raised a hand, not in anger, but in control. The court will determine intent, the judge said evenly. Not counsel. That sentence landed heavier than any reprimand. The judge ordered a supplemental review into the origin and presentation of the documents, including communications related to their assembly. Sanctions were not imposed yet, but the door was left open. That mattered. Because consequences don't always arrive all at once. Sometimes they arrive as inevitability. Jason sat motionless. Brandy stared straight ahead, jaw set. For the first time since the dinner, neither of them looked confident. Outside the courtroom, Taryn spoke quietly. This is where the ground shifts. The estate issues now move forward, with you in control. Control. Not revenge. Not humiliation. Control. And as we walked down the courthouse steps, I realized something else. Justice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it speaks once, and never has to repeat itself. With the objection dismissed, the estate finally came back into focus. Not as leverage. Not as bait. As responsibility. Taryn and I met the following week to address what the court's confirmation unlocked. Provisions that had been paused were now active again. Discretionary powers that required my consent were back where they belonged. With me. Kelvin's planning had been precise. He'd anticipated conflict without predicting its shape. Trust language triggered not by emotion, but by behavior. Challenges to authority. Attempts to bypass consent. Actions taken in bad faith. Those triggers had now been met. Taryn laid out the options without pressure. Some paths were generous. Others were restrictive. All of them were lawful. All of them permanent. I chose restraint with structure. Jason's inheritance wouldn't be eliminated. It would be conditioned. Access tied to compliance, transparency, and time. No lump sums. No unilateral control. Oversight built in. Not punishment. Protection. Then we addressed the legacy trust. Nyla's name sat at the center of it. Education. Healthcare. Housing. Safeguards layered so no one could reroute her future again, not quietly, not strategically. Taryn confirmed the filings would be submitted immediately. As I signed the documents, I felt a quiet certainty settle. This wasn't about winning. It was about closing doors that should never have been opened. When the meeting ended, Taryn looked at me and said, "Most people don't think this far ahead." I didn't either, I replied. Until I had to. Outside, the city moved like it always did. Unaware. Unchanged. But inside the system, something fundamental had shifted. The power they tried to take had been transferred. Not back to me. Forward. The paperwork moved quickly after that. Not because anyone rushed, but because nothing was in dispute anymore. Court confirmations tend to clear the air. Institutions respond differently when authority is settled. Banks stop hesitating. Administrators stop asking side questions. Everything returns to its proper lane. Taryn kept me informed as filings were acknowledged and trusts activated. No commentary. Just confirmations. Dates. Reference numbers. One message stood out. The legacy trust for Nyla was officially funded. That was the moment I allowed myself to pause. Not celebrate. Just breathe. I drove to the park that afternoon, sat on a bench, and watched children run past with careless energy. Nyla would be there someday, older, steadier, protected in ways she didn't yet understand. And that mattered more than any courtroom victory. Later that evening, Taryn called again. Access controls are in place, he said. No one can alter terms without your authorization. That was the point. Control wasn't about dominance. It was about preventing repetition. When people rewrite truth once, they usually try again. This ensured they couldn't. That night, Jason sent a single message. I didn't know it would go this far. I read it without anger. Without satisfaction. Far was a matter of perspective. They had tried to erase a mother. I had secured a future. I didn't reply. Because some lessons aren't taught through conversation. They're taught through boundaries that hold. And as I turned off the lights in my house, I knew the most important part of the story had already been written, not in words, but in conditions that would outlast all of us. The conditions took effect quietly. No announcements. No confrontations. Just notices sent, accounts adjusted, access redefined. That's how real consequences usually arrive, not with sound, but with absence. Jason learned first. His attorney contacted Taryn with questions about timelines, release schedules, discretionary reviews. The tone was careful now. Respectful. Gone was the confidence that had filled the dinner table. Taryn answered once, in writing. Compliance would be reviewed annually. Distributions would be modest and supervised. Any attempt to circumvent the structure would trigger automatic suspension. Clear. Final. Jason didn't call me. Not right away. I imagine he needed time to understand what had happened, that the power he thought he was securing had already moved past him. Randy learned next. Her access to estate-related information was formally severed. No proxies. No administrative roles. No visibility into trusts or accounts tied to Kelvin's name. That cut deeper than money. Control was her currency. Without it, there was nothing left to manage. I didn't celebrate either development. I noted them. Logged them. Then moved on. That restraint surprised even me. But revenge had never been the point. Stability was. That evening, I sat in my living room and looked at a photo of Nyla on the shelf. Smiling. Unaware. Safe. The cycle had been interrupted. Not by force. By structure. And for the first time since the dinner, I felt something close to peace, not because they'd lost, but because the future no longer depended on their behavior. It depended on boundaries. And boundaries, once set, don't argue. They hold. The silence that followed was different. Not tense. Not waiting. Settled. Days passed without messages, filings, or quiet probes through intermediaries. The system had closed its doors, and everyone inside it knew where they stood. Then Taryn called with one last administrative update. The court finalized the supplemental review, he said. No sanctions hearing. But the record reflects submission of unreliable documents and failure to disclose sourcing. That was enough. Courts don't need to punish loudly to correct behavior. A permanent notation does the work over time. Attorneys read it. Judges remember it. Patterns follow people longer than rumors ever could. Randy's attempt at control had left a trace she couldn't erase. Not public shame. Professional consequence. Jason's counsel requested clarification on one narrow point, whether future petitions could revisit the issue of parental status. Taryn's response was short. No. That matter is settled. Settled meant closed. No reopening. No reinterpretation. No second chance at the same lie. I sat with that word for a long time. Settled. It carried a kind of peace that apologies never do. Later that afternoon, I received a message from Nyla's school about an upcoming event. A reminder. Ordinary. Small. I smiled at my phone. Life had resumed its normal rhythms, and that was the real victory. Not the courtroom. Not the paperwork. But the quiet return to days that weren't defined by defense. As evening came, I walked through my house and noticed how still it felt, not empty, just complete. The kind of stillness that comes after something finishes the way it's supposed to. They had tried to turn my identity into a question. The system had turned it into a fact. And facts, once settled, don't ask permission to exist. The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It moved quietly, through social channels I no longer occupied. I heard about it secondhand, through a friend who mentioned a tense family gathering I hadn't attended, through a cousin who said conversations stopped when Brandy entered a room. No one confronted her. No one needed to. People don't argue with court records. They adjust around them. Jason withdrew from view. Missed events. Shortened visits. He didn't correct anyone, but he didn't repeat the lie either. That silence carried its own weight. It wasn't accountability, but it was consequence. I didn't step into that space. I didn't explain myself. I let the truth do what it always does when it's documented, it spread without effort. One afternoon, I ran into someone from the dinner at the grocery store. They hesitated, then said, "I'm glad that got cleared up." Cleared up. Not "I'm sorry." Not "we should have known better." Just acknowledgement. That was enough. Because vindication wasn't something I needed to hear out loud anymore. The record had already spoken. At home, I reorganized my study. Old binders went back into the cabinet. Not hidden. Filed. Where history belongs. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt finished. That night, as I turned off the light, I thought about how easily a lie can live when people are uncomfortable, and how quickly it dies when someone refuses to perform. They had tried to erase me in public. I had restored myself in private. And that difference would outlast every whisper that followed. Jason reached out a week later. Not through lawyers. Not through careful language. Just a call. I let it ring twice before answering. His voice sounded smaller than I remembered. Not broken. Just unsure. Like someone who'd lost the script and hadn't written a new one yet. "I didn't think it would end like this," he said. I didn't respond right away. Silence has a way of inviting honesty, or exposing the lack of it. It felt like everything was already moving, he added. Like I didn't have a choice. That was as close as he came. No apology. No acknowledgement of what he'd done to me. Just distance. Just framing. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I spoke carefully. "You always had a choice," I said. "You just chose not to use it." There was a pause. I could hear his breath on the line. "I don't know what happens now," he said. "That depends on you," I replied. And on time. I didn't offer reassurance. I didn't reopen the past. I didn't soften the boundary. Because reconciliation, if it ever came, couldn't be negotiated in a moment like this. It would have to be earned. We ended the call without resolution. No promises. No anger. Just reality. Afterward, I sat quietly and noticed something important. The conversation hadn't drained me. It hadn't shaken me. It hadn't reopened wounds. That told me everything I needed to know. The power dynamic had changed, not because I'd taken something from him, but because I no longer needed anything from him at all. And that kind of independence doesn't announce itself. It simply exists. In the days after that call, I didn't feel the urge to revisit it. No replaying words. No wondering what I should have said differently. The conversation settled where it belonged, in the past tense. That was new. For years, I had carried responsibility like a reflex. If something broke, I assumed it was mine to fix. If someone was uncomfortable, I absorbed it. Motherhood had trained me that way. This situation broke that habit cleanly. I thought about forgiveness, briefly, not as a gesture, not as a reunion, but as a private release. The idea surfaced, then passed. Not yet. Maybe not ever. And that was okay. Forgiveness without accountability isn't peace. It's permission. What I felt instead was something quieter. Acceptance. Not of what had happened, but of what would never be the same again. Jason wasn't a child who needed protection anymore. He was a man who had made a choice and lived inside its consequences. My role had changed. Not diminished. Clarified. That clarity showed up in small ways. I stopped checking my phone reflexively. I stopped anticipating messages that might never come. My days filled themselves naturally, with routines, with silence that felt earned instead of lonely. One afternoon, I visited Nyla's school for her event. She spotted me immediately and waved, her smile wide and unguarded. In that moment, everything aligned. She didn't know about courtrooms or records or trusts. She only knew I was there. And that presence, steady, unquestioned, felt like the truest form of legacy. As I drove home, I realized the story no longer felt unfinished. Justice had already happened. What remained was life. And life, once reclaimed, doesn't ask for permission to move forward. The estate closed quietly. No ceremony. No final confrontation. Just confirmation notices, stamped and archived, locking everything into place. The kind of ending that doesn't feel dramatic, but feels permanent. I stood in my study one last time, looking at the cabinet where I'd kept records for decades. I didn't remove anything. I didn't destroy anything. I simply shut the drawer and locked it. Not out of fear. Out of completion. What I had protected was now protected by the system itself. The house felt different after that. Lighter. Not because the past had vanished, but because it no longer demanded attention. I moved through my days without bracing for impact, without rehearsing defenses in my head. That was the real victory. Not the ruling. Not the trust documents. The quiet return of my own life. I thought about the dinner table again, not with pain, but with distance. How easily a moment can be weaponized when people forget that truth doesn't need volume to survive. They had tried to take my name. They had tried to turn motherhood into a technicality. Instead, they reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten. Identity isn't granted by consensus. It's confirmed by record and lived by choice. I chose not to chase forgiveness. I chose not to demand understanding. I chose boundaries that didn't require explanation. And in doing that, I reclaimed something deeper than status. Peace. As evening settled in, I stepped onto the porch and watched the light fade, steady and unhurried. The story didn't end with applause or reconciliation. It ended with a door closing, softly, firmly, behind me. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't look back. If you liked this story, please like, subscribe, and share it. If you have a unique story of your own, share it in the comments below. Thank you for listening.